The story I'm about to tell you never happened according to the El Paso Police Department, despite the fact that this was an active shooter and a murder scene. On October 16, 2022, the unthinkable happened. 7 officers from graveyard shift were at the EP clubhouse at 8500 Dyer due to a massive crowd. My husband, Sergeant Camp, arrived at the scene and met with the other officers when 2 males exchanged gunfire in the parking lot. My husband, along with his fellow officers, immediately ran to the threat with their weapons out. My husband called out, shots fired, over the radio. Officers observed a male subject on the ground who had been shot in the chest with various shell casings at the scene. The crowd started to get aggressive towards the officers and believed the officers had shot the subject. The tensions grew, and before officers could properly gain compliance, the crowd began fighting with the officers. The management of the bar stated there were approximately 250 people in the parking lot. Immediate notification for FMS to render aid and for immediate police backup was called. My husband and his officers were now facing an active shooter with mass casualties, yet nobody was able to assist due to the lack of manpower from all regions. They were isolated, face to face with an armed and fighting crowd. A desk officer came to render aid and left his post armed with a shotgun, who observed 2 marked police units parked side by side at the Super Lodge Hotel located on Dyer. These officers were later identified as Sergeant Adan Chavez and Lieutenant Frank Rodriguez. This sergeant and lieutenant were working an off-duty assignment in full police uniform, making sure they were safe and sound against any fear of lethal threat. Both cowards ignored the call and failed to respond to a tactical alert response for officer assistance. These 2 cowards of the El Paso Police Department left these officers to die amongst the imminent threat. They were 60 seconds away from the incident. If they had responded as they should have, the situation could have been much different. It's speculative to imagine that maybe a life could have been saved. They failed their city. They failed their community. They failed their officers. They failed their oath. Lieutenant Frank Rodriguez put his life ahead of everybody else's and made sure his life was safe from harm. He ran from a threat, knowing his own personnel from the Northeast needed help. It was obvious making extra cash was more important than saving a member of the community's life or an officer. When he eventually showed up at the scene, the police video footage demonstrates no sense of urgency whatsoever. He eventually strolled up to the scene and started to berate them. My husband then gained all of the facts of Lieutenant Frank Rodriguez and Sergeant Adan Chavez failing to render aid, documented and spent time gathering the necessary evidence, and wrote over 25 pages with hard, factual evidence, including videos, radio transmissions of the incident, everything. However, Commander Julian Siriaga, who received the documentation, began to highlight certain paragraphs of the document against her lieutenant, Frank Rodriguez, and started questioning why my husband was writing emotion into the details. Please understand this. This is a commander who was more concerned about the way my husband was illustrating the documentation of emotion, where he was placed in a life and death situation to include his fellow officers. The concern of policy and procedures failing to follow did not apply to Rodriguez, but it applied to my husband. Internal Affairs took the complaint and began investigating. My husband was then placed under an investigator newly appointed Stephanie Ray and Arturo Flores, who were favorites of Lieutenant Rodriguez, who worked on his shift at the Northeast Regional Command Center. This is surely a conflict of interest. My husband, along with those brave officers, including the murdered victim, didn't stand a chance at this point. Needless to say, my husband's complaint plus interviews from the other officers and their testimonials meant nothing, like their lives that night when Frank Rodriguez refused to help. The verdict came down, and would you believe it? Frank Rodriguez was unfounded on all wrongdoings. My husband was found sustained on discipline based purely on Commander Julie Insiriaga's recommendation that my husband wrote in an emotional manner of a life and death situation. This is another fine example of the El Paso Police Department protecting their own and tearing down good, brave officers. The El Paso Police Department, they couldn't care less if they died that night or survived. There were no awards or appreciation for the officers' conduct and their extraordinary bravery. My husband even reached out to the El Paso Municipal Police Officers Association to have a segment written up for these officers' acts of bravery in the police newspaper, and this too was declined to print. Since this, there has been a significant vendetta against my husband from the chief's office, then and now, Julian Siriaga, and Lieutenant Frank Rodriguez. This is your police department today, under the rule of Chief Pasillas and Assistant Chief Insiriaga. They wonder why there is low morale, low retention, and nobody wants to join the El Paso Police Department. My husband's experience as an El Paso police officer has been blackened by the very hands of incompetent leaders who are willing to save their own lives before any other lives. Your death in the line of fire is free advertising for recruitment as the patriotic symbols come into play. The hand over the heart and the Psalms of the Bible will be read as tear stains of black run down these officials' cheeks. The real stains of blue are the rude awakenings of every man and woman who have been forgotten, victimized, and retaliated against by their department for daring to speak up. It's time for an overhaul of this department. The Department of Justice must intervene and take over the operations because these people are playing with your rights, your freedom, and your lives. Enough is enough. Cops against malicious power.